Okay. All right. I hope you have and are maybe still enjoying your lunch. Mandy asked me to get started so we stay a little bit on schedule. So here I am, just carrying over from our session on mindfulness. And I want to thank Mandy to invite me to talk a little bit about mindful leadership. Which is absolutely one of my favorite topics to talk about. This course, this idea of mindful leadership came about when a colleague and I developed a course for our MBA program. And we wanted to figure out how we can integrate mindfulness in an MBA course. And so we thought, well, leaders have to be mindful. And so it was kind of a new thing for us, actually looking into the research. Was there research on connecting mindfulness and leadership? And there isn't that much, so we are doing that now. But there is research that connects mindfulness to some of the things we showed you this morning: communication, decision-making, social awareness, self-awareness. And all those attributes looked like, well, that's important for leadership. So we can probably develop a framework that supports that mindfulness has to be connected to effective leadership. So we developed this course, and we've been teaching it for 5 years now. Some of the students back there have taken it. Some of it have to wait a little while because I go on sabbatical next year. But it has been very, very popular and very successful. And in the meantime, we actually developed some executive versions of the Mindful Leadership program that we teach to all kinds of organizations and businesses, including NDOT, including Microsoft, including Custom Ink here in town, and also across the country. Like I mentioned, we are working with judges a lot, teaching them management skills and presiding and chief judges. But we are having, this is a new thing we are doing this November in Sedona. We have a mindfulness retreat for judges. And you may not know much about the judiciary, but that can be a very traumatizing job to be sitting there as a judge, especially in criminal cases. And so mindfulness is very helpful with them to reduce stress reduction, to reduce their stress, but also in terms of implicit bias. So in the judicial literature, they talk a lot about the effect of mindfulness on not having implicit bias in judgment. And so that's kind of the background on what I'm doing with mindfulness in the business world and in organizations across the country. Now, what I'm giving you today, of course, in a half an hour, I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version of this, of what we are thinking about when we talk about mindful leadership. Okay? All right. So we already talked this morning about mindfulness, so there will be just a short little recap. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about leadership in terms of our view on leadership. And you may know that leadership is one of the most written about topics in many different disciplines, in all kinds of social sciences, in business, in politics, in coaching, in athletics. So leadership is a very, very prominent topic. So there are many models, there are many definitions, and that's why it's a little important that I clarify how we are thinking about leadership. And then I bring mindfulness and leadership together by explaining how we think that mindfulness contributes to the effectiveness of leaders. Okay, so mindfulness, as you learned this morning, if you didn't know it yet, is non-judgmental moment-to-moment awareness, and particularly it is what allows us to create a mental space between stimulus and response. And I want to point out one more time that in that mental space, that's where we have freedom. That's where we have choice, and that's where we have humanity. And what Colleen mentioned at the end this morning was about that. We all have things in our life that are difficult and that we carry with us. And it's in that mental space where we can hold them. We can hold them lightly. They don't have to grip us, all right? And so mindfulness, moment-to-moment awareness, being able to pay attention, being able to make choices. Okay. Leadership. Let me begin by asking you to think of a time when you thought you were an effective leader. And I don't mean necessarily at work. It can be at work, but at home, with your family, with friends. Any situation that you remember that comes in your mind where you think, yeah, I was the leader in that. So I'll give you just a couple seconds to think of that. And now, of course, follow-up question. How did you decide just now that you were an effective leader in that position or in that situation? What were you thinking? Yes, when we did this and this, I think I was the leader. I think I was the person who was leading that effort or made that happen, right? So what does it mean when you're an effective leader? And I just basically told you, you make something happen. Leaders are the people who make something happen. And when you think back of people, maybe even superiors that you had in your career, or in my case, it would be a dean of in my college or president of the university. And if I think back and I would have to decide whether somebody was effective or not, and somebody who would not be concluded by me that they are effective would be somebody who didn't do anything, right? Nothing happened, nothing bad, nothing good, nothing happened. Okay, so the first thing is that we approach leadership from a very simple and broad way of thinking. Anybody can be a leader. It's simply about making something happen. So anybody sitting in this room, independent of what position you are in, you can be a leader in a variety of different circumstances. And the people I work with, we take turns when we are leaders without words. It just depends on what's going on, right? Okay. So how did you make something happen? That scenario I asked you to think about, where you felt you were an effective leader, probably because you made something happen. How did you make something happen? How did you do that? Throw something out. Action. Who said that? Action. Tell me a little bit more what you think here.
Well, you have to forecast the action steps. You have to know where you're going with the picture.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's certain things that have to happen to make that big thing happen. And you need other people who make those other little things happen, right? So we make things happen by influencing others' behaviors. Are you with me? So when you're thinking of that scenario where you felt you were an effective leader, you made something happen by influencing other people's behavior, right? So how do we do that? How do we influence other people's behavior? And here we generally talk about the fact that in order to wield influence, you have to have access to power. And in the organizational environment, We have access to power bases that are either coming with the position, because you're the VP or you're the supervisor or the CEO, certain powers come with that. And then there are power bases that reside within you as the person. So the power bases that you can use to influence others that come from the position are legitimate power, which means simply authority. You are given the authority to tell somebody to do something. What you were saying, actions have to happen. Well, I can just tell you to do it, right? That would be legitimate power. Coercive power would be, I tell you what to do, and if you don't do it, there will be a negative consequence for not doing it. So I will, in the future, ensure that you will be doing it. Or the opposite, there's reward power, that I will reward you for doing what I want you to do. So I'm influencing your behavior based on these power bases that I get from being the boss. Okay? Now, we also have power that resides within us as the person. The first one is called expert power. So I can influence your behavior because you see me as an expert, whatever the issue may be. So hopefully I'm able to influence your behavior a little bit today because I'm an expert in leadership and mindfulness and business. That's what I do. That's what I think about for 30 years. So possibly I can influence your behavior as you're going forward simply because you see me as having that kind of power. We also can influence other people's behavior because we may have referent power. It's also called sometimes charisma. And referent power is that I can influence somebody's behavior because they can easily associate with the kind of person I am, the values I have, what I want to accomplish, maybe a little bit of admiration in like, oh, I want to be a little bit like that person. I'm using that person as a reference point. That's why it's called referent power, okay? So we are talking about leaders being people who are making a change by being able to influence other people's behavior by accessing different power bases. And here comes the main point about this, that we know that the most effective power bases are expert power plus referent plus reward power. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the position is much less important than the person in the position. You see? Because I can give that same position, person A, person B, if they can supplement the position power with the personal power, expert and referent power, they can't be effective leaders. Does that make sense? Okay. So what people value in a leader starts with you, it starts with the person. So it's all, when we are talking about leadership development, leadership training, from our perspective, it's all about developing you yourself. And it begins always with knowing who you are yourself. And now you can see a little bit where the mindfulness also comes in. Mindfulness increases self-awareness. So by being more mindful, you understand your own behaviors better and your own drivers. Okay, so research tells us that when people are asked what are the most important attributes a leader should have from a list, we get those 4 things, by far the most commonly mentioned things: inspiring, forward-looking, competent, and honest. And hopefully you see the link here to referent power, expert power, right? Competent, expert power, inspiring, referent power. So the ideas of power base are very much supported by what people tell us, what is important in a leader. Now, how does mindfulness fit in here? I think we all could agree that these people on that slide have been effective leaders. They are all in different fields, different disciplines. Maybe they use slightly different ways of getting things done. And going back to my earlier definition, leaders are people who make things happen. And all of them on that slide made big things happen. Okay? So what is the commonness that they have? What is the common denominator that they have? And you already know partially the answer to that. They were able to influence other people's behavior, all right? Either by using referent power or by expert power, by also supplementing with reward power. But just to kind of clarify this, so here are these famous leaders, many of them not having any major position. If you look through this list, not all of them were presidents or CEOs, yet they were very effective leaders, again, driving that point home that it's not about the power that you get from the position. Okay. And also, just to clarify that for yourself, who would you follow? You know, there is the list of these people, and I gave you a list of these attributes, and what kind of person would you follow? And generally, the answer that somewhere along the line comes out is, well, somebody I trust. Does that make sense? Trust. So what we know and how we approach leadership is by recognizing that the foundation of effective leadership in the end is about a person's ability to build trust with the people that they are influencing and leading, okay? So these attributes, and I just go back to them again, these attributes are not isolated, coincidental things. They are all attributes that result in a person's ability to build trust. So let me talk a little bit more about that. Somehow, since I went backwards, I think it doesn't let me go forward now. Okay, we went one. I always tell my students when something like that happens, perfect opportunity to practice mindfulness. Okay. Okay, somewhere. There we go. So thank you. So trust for us is the foundation of leadership and building trusting relationships. So what is trust? And yeah, maybe it's not a rhetorical question. Let me make that a question. What is trust? How do you know that you trust somebody? Anybody? Jody, since I know some people's names, how do you know you trust somebody? Okay, but how do you know, what feeling do you have when you trust somebody versus a person sitting over here that you would say, I don't really trust that person? Say again? Past behavior. Integrity, did that person have integrity? Yeah. Safety, absolutely. And there was another hand up here somewhere. Safety? Yeah. So we define trust as the willingness to be vulnerable. So when I ask you, do you trust this person? And you tell me, yeah, that tells me that you are willing to be vulnerable. You feel safe with that person, okay? So when I'm telling you that in order to be an effective leader, you need to create a trusting environment, so that implies that you have to create an environment in which people feel safe and in which they feel they are okay with being vulnerable. Yeah, that sounds pretty hard to do. But here is what we know about trust. And this is the definition of interpersonal trust. And quick little side note, I am on my sabbatical, I will actually do a big 4-country study where I will look at how building trust differs from country to country. What is important in country A versus country B in creating a trusting environment, all right? So, but these are the determinants of trust, which means that I'm more likely to trust somebody that I perceive as being competent. We already had that competence up on our list. Somebody that I perceive as having integrity. That's what Jody said a moment ago. And somebody that I perceive as being benevolent. What does that word mean? What does the word benevolent mean? Say again? Selfless, okay. Any other thoughts? Selfless, benevolent versus malevolent. Yeah, focusing on the greater good, having other people's best interest in mind. Okay, so it's somebody that I perceive it's not all about them. They actually care about me also. Okay, so I'm more likely to trust somebody that I see as being able and having the skills required, somebody that is honest and has integrity. How do I know that somebody has integrity? So somebody said past behavior. Integrity, you can also look at in terms of consistency in behavior. So consistency in behavior over time, but also consistency in behavior between what somebody says and what somebody does. Okay, so integrity, you can watch and you can come to a conclusion by simply observing somebody. Okay, and then finally, benevolence. How do I know whether somebody is benevolent towards me? Again, past experiences with that person. Does that person even ever talk to me to find out who I am? What's important to me? Somebody who never asks me about me wouldn't be able to have my best interests in mind because they don't know what my best interests are, right? So talking about effective leadership and trust being the foundation for effective leadership, it's all about being able to create an environment where you, the leader, is perceived in this way. Okay, so there comes mindfulness in the play, all right? We think that, and again, we are doing research right now to provide empirical evidence for this, but we think that by having a mindfulness practice and developing self and social awareness and increasing your emotional intelligence and being a more effective communicator, being more patient, not being a stressed out maniac, you will be more likely to create an environment of trust by being more competent, by having more integrity, and by actually caring about what's going on around you, okay? And that results in behaviors that, make you into somebody that can make stuff happen, important stuff happen. And I don't want to go backwards again, but on the slide with the pictures, I could probably talk about each of those people and could pinpoint how they went about creating that trust with the people that were important to move things forward. Okay, so effective leadership depends on building relationships and trust. And here's one of a story that I just love to tell because it's so innocent, but it makes exactly that point about the importance of building relationships and trust. Some of you may have seen the Ken Burns documentary on PBS about the Roosevelt brothers. It was on in 2014, I think. And the very last episode was about Franklin Roosevelt and his death, which was right before the end of the Second World War. So it was a big loss in a very crisis time. And there was a big funeral. And the story that was told in the documentary is that there was a man watching the funeral, and he was just crying, and so upset. And there was another man standing next to him, and he felt sorry, and he walked over and said, "Oh, sir, you're so upset. Did you know the president?" And the man who was crying said, "No, I didn't, but he knew me." And that is the point about, that however that came about, that person had the feeling of that the president cared about him, that there was benevolence, okay? So that's what we are talking about in building relationships and trust, and how mindfulness will facilitate that process. One last thing I wanted to mention is that from a practical perspective, we are talking about a type of leadership that is referred to as transformational rather than transactional leadership. And Kouzes and Posner wrote a book, The Leadership Challenge, years and years ago. I think it's almost 30 years now, that developed 5 practices of transformational leadership. So those 5 practices, if you develop them, are basically ways of how to create relationships with the people that you are leading, and that they result in trust. Okay, so when we do leadership training, and these guys were fantastic in developing programs where we have self-assessments where you are in those 5 practices, 360 assessments where your people who report to you or peers also assess you in terms of to what extent are you engaging in these practices. So we have a baseline, and then we know which practices you would most benefit on working on. And each of these 5 practices has 6 specific behaviors. So I like to tell you that because what I've talked about so far is so theoretical. Here is a tangible thing that we actually can do to translate this type of leadership into practice with integrating mindfulness. Okay? And then I want to leave you with many people. This is a very well-known quote, but it is very helpful in terms of making the connection between mindfulness and behaviors and effectiveness in your own life. So I'm just going to read it to you. "Watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, for they become actions." And when we were doing the mindfulness practice earlier today, it was about becoming aware of your thoughts and then coming back to your breath. "Watch your actions, for they become habits. Watch your habits, for they become character. Watch your character, for it becomes your destiny." And that's all I had on this, and I hope I stayed within my time limit. But thank you for your attention.